Hey everybody, so this video is going to be quickly wrapping up the difference between ESTP and ENTP, or ESF versus ENF in CPT. So the biggest point of difference between these two types is in the nature of the sensing thinking versus intuitive thinking. Essentially, when you pair intuition to thinking or pair sensing to feeling, that results in a very distinct kind of property of the process. So even before talking about the whole SE versus NE stuff, we can pretty much cover a large portion of the differences between these types, just looking at the differences in thinkings and feelings style. So ENTP is a sensing thinker, and therefore their logic tends to be much more precise and analytical. Oftentimes an ENTP knows exactly why they're doing something. They have a more deterministic sense of causality, owing to the more sequential and precisely defined semantic nature of sensing paired to thinking, introverted sensing and introverted thinking in this type. And because, of course, the introverted thinking aspect rather than extroverted thinking, they are very keenly aware of the principle, the logic. They're good at explaining why something has to be done a certain way. Oftentimes these types can be very skilled individuals, but it's often an ENTP who's more like tinkering upon their skill set, really trying to get something exact, repeating something over and over and over again until it becomes like muscle memory, second nature. So an aptitude for explaining exactly why they're doing something, a more deterministic approach to reality where this thing will lead to this thing, and a higher capacity to kind of tinker and microanalyze things in order to really get the underlying truth. ESTPs, by contrast, have intuition paired to thinking, so this is a much more general and holistic approach to logic. Whereas the ENTP's SITI is very deterministic, the NITI of ESTPs are more probabilistic. It's more about value over time. As long as I do this general thing 100 times, I'll get a good result. They're not nearly as interested in the ENTP as precisely analysing exactly why they're doing a certain thing, and therefore they're going to have a higher difficulty than the ENTP at explaining why they are doing things to other people, explaining why something is the way that it is. There's more of a kind of it just makes sense aspect to NI and TI in this type. The NITI of the ESTP is a lot more no nonsense, let's not beat around the bush, let's not get too stuck into the details of analysis. And because the ENTP, by contrast, wants to get things right, they want to know why they're doing something and a bit more deterministic about it, they might rehearse a lot more, they might kind of second guess themselves and get into analysis paralysis a bit more. The ESTPs, by contrast, are just a lot happier to kind of wing it. We'll just kind of see what happens, play it as we go. It'll probably work out just fine, especially if I'm going to do it multiple different times. And therefore, even if an ESTP does make a mistake, they may not have as much impetus to correct it as an ENTP might, because they won't necessarily see it as a flaw in the programming. They'll just see it as a consequence of probability. Okay, yeah, it didn't go well this time, but it might go well the next time. And the ESTP is just going to be a lot more prone to generalizations than the ENTP. The NITI gives them a certain speed, a certain eagerness to really put a concept or principle into reality, to do something with what they know immediately rather than later. But it can also result in a kind of more superficial overview of certain things, because they don't really want to get into the details, and therefore they won't necessarily have an in-depth understanding of the why. But by contrast, the ESTP sensing is paired to feeling, resulting in more of a kind of concrete sense of identity, a firmer sense of personal boundaries, but also maybe more difficulty kind of adapting one's own identity to fit a new external context. Therefore, they might just be a lot more picky with who they hang out with, maybe be a little bit more rigid in their value sets, and maybe have a more slightly conservative mindset when it comes to people. Sensing feeling is also a little bit more nuanced than intuitive feeling, and therefore ESTPs might be more aware of specific emotions within themselves and more at ease allowing ambivalence to exist, allowing themselves to both like something and hate something, and kind of seeing that just as the way life is. They're not always trying to maintain like a good vibe or a good state, and there can be kind of just more conflicted emotions going on within a sensing feeling pairing. The ENTP, by contrast, is an intuitive feeler, and therefore they're much more oriented towards the general vibe, the state. They'll want to preserve a state over time. They'll have an easy time kind of crafting an identity, a persona, and presenting it to people as well. Intuitive feeling is generally a little bit more adaptable than sensing feeling. So there is a higher probability of the ENTP knowing a lot more people from a more diverse array of backgrounds. That all being said, intuitive feeling tends to have a harder time identifying exactly what its boundaries are. So ENTPs can be maybe a little bit more messed around by other people. They might have a harder time pushing standards upon other people as well. So the natural kind of caveat of a more like fluid and adaptable intuitive feeling convergence is going to be a kind of higher difficulty entering conflict situations, asserting one's own personal boundaries and knowing what they are to begin with. And with the bulk of it out of the way, we can kind of quickly go through the functions and positions. So both of these types are feeling convergence, and feeling here is extroverted and in agency position. So FE in agency position ensues a kind of a fair degree of comfort with social risk-taking, subordinate as it is to the novelty of lens dominance. Both of these types are going to be kind of comfortable playing with the social atmosphere, playing with the kind of extroverted feeling vibes in order to kind of see what novel new social experiences can be made and shared with other people. So both types are definitely capable of putting their foot in it. But I have noticed ENTPs, because of the extroverted intuition assignment, which is a lot more general and vague, can put their foot in it a little bit more than ESTPs, because ESTP's SEFE is a lot more precise. So even though the ESTP does take a lot of social risks, they're going to be a lot more calculated and incremental, small social risks compared to that of the ENTP. And this is a natural extension of the sensing feeling pairing. Since the ESTP is aware of what the boundaries are, they're also aware of what other people's boundaries are. NEFE, since it struggles with its own boundaries, can also struggle with the boundaries of other people. So all of this is just a big, complex network of interacting parts that produce an emergent property. The emergent property here being the nature of social risk-taking. Furthermore, NEFE is directed towards a more broad and diffuse area of the external social landscape. And therefore you are going to find someone who, generally speaking, is going to be more comfortable kind of navigating larger social structures, projecting themselves to a crowd, for example, maybe even navigating lots of different social connections in the same physical space. Whereas SEFE might even be a little bit more private and insular. It likes the people it likes, doesn't like the people it doesn't like, and it's going to be much more selective with who it engages. I've actually noticed SEFE to be a lot more dismissive of people that don't meet its particular standards or social requirements. If it doesn't see someone as fun, it won't bother with them. Whereas NEFE is actually quite adept at making someone who doesn't necessarily seem immediately fun to be around just through its more kind of transmutive processes. And again, this plays into why NEFE will tend to know a greater variety of people, because it's way less selective. And it enjoys a level of social exploration. ENTP's opposing pairing is SITI, whereas the opposing pairing of ESTPs is NITI. As we've already kind of covered, I realise now in hindsight, NITI is a lot more probabilistic and SITI is a lot more deterministic. ENTPs want to get it right, they're a lot more microanalytical, and they can actually get into kind of analytical spirals when they're in a more kind of maybe introverted or subdued state, where they kind of like feel a difficulty acting because they haven't found the exact answer yet. And they might sometimes use that kind of analytical process as a kind of like way to bypass their own introverted feeling. So they'll try and intellectualize the problem, for example, rather than confront their own internal emotionality, or make hard decisions about their own boundaries, etc., etc. And it's not that the ESTP doesn't also have that introverted feeling blind spot, but the way that they kind of navigate it is a little bit different. ESTPs are happier to go into their own personal boundaries, but they have a lot harder time kind of like adapting themselves, for lack of a better term. Often ESTPs just are the way they are, and they can try and kind of play the social game, but they'll have a greater struggle kind of like relinquishing their own boundaries and standards in order to kind of harmonize with people a bit better. So NITI and the ESTP is more of a kind of dismissive pairing. It's more used to say like, well, this is generally true, let's not think about that. This person's this, let's not think about that. We don't need to worry about it, etc., etc. Or, you know, this will be true if we do it a lot of the time, so let's not go into analysis because as long as we keep doing it, it'll work out pretty good. So both types definitely intellectualize or just kind of go to this high cerebral level in order to kind of avoid going into their own introverted feeling internal world. But the nature of those internal worlds are very different for each of the types. ENTPs want to avoid taking themselves seriously in a lot of ways, whereas ESTPs want to avoid like relinquishing themselves to begin with. And finally, touching on the attitudes of CBT, the SEFE, NEFE of the types are convergent, and therefore they do like to take social risks, etc., as I've already talked about. With extroverted intuition being more convergent in the ENTP, there's a greater kind of desire to explore. With extroverted sensing convergent in the ESTP, there's a stronger desire to kind of to really engage and to act on something that could hold merit. And with extroverted sensing conversion to an ESTP, there's a lot greater impetus to act immediately rather than later. So the ESTP generally wants to put thought into action sooner, whereas the ENTP generally wants to explore the possibilities sooner. So this ensues ESTPs being less willing to explore, see all of the different possibilities, see what the options are, etc. Whereas ENTPs will be less willing to put things into actual concrete action. When we talk about isolated things like extroverted intuition, extroverted sensing, it does become a little bit more vague, but we can still talk about it on a trait-based level. These are the things you're more likely to see, but not necessarily all the time. And if we're talking about like probabilism versus determinism, you could probably argue CPT wants to become a little bit more deterministic than MBTI, which is a little bit more probabilistic, because with MBTI it's more statistical. Like if 100 people type as ISFJ, 60, 70 of them might have the underlying cognition that represents, that those letters represent. CPT, since it wants to get to the very ground level, as granular as it possibly can, it wants to really kind of decrease that margin of error. Both probabilism and determinism have their place. Nothing here, of course, is going to be truly deterministic, and SITI isn't even truly deterministic. These are just levels of probability. SITI scales up the level of probability. CPT, even though I'm predominantly NITI, it is becoming more SITI, and therefore it's trying to scale up the probability of these things actually being true. And if you can scale up the probability of these things being true, it can become true idiographically as well as nomothetically. So it's less about 60 out of 100 people being like X or Y, and much more about this specific person is probably going to be this, and you don't need a large sample pool for it to be true. So I hope this video has been useful. If you know anyone who you suspect might be an ENTP or ESTP, or might be confused between the two, definitely share the video with them. And I'll be back in about a week or so. For now, take care.